World champion Magnus Carlsen faces Jan Nepomniachtchi in the final of the Chess Legends tournament. And what an amazing first day we had. Carlsen won the first rapid game, second was drawn, and this is game number 3. Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces, and it followed game 1. It's a Sicilian defence, and we're going to go into a Najdorf variation. That's this pawn move at the side of the board, a6. And here Nepo repeated his move of game 1, rook g1. It's a little bit unusual, but it has been seen before. The idea, of course, is to advance the g-pawn up the board. It looks such a strange move. There are many decent moves against this. It's interesting, Carlsen himself has played rook g1 with some success actually, so it's funny that he's having to meet it himself. And he played quite typically a really uncompromising move, b5. So this is one of the ideas behind playing a6, that you claim ground on the queen side very quickly, and there is potential to push, to attack the knight, drive it away and undermine support for the e-pawn, and also to bring this bishop out onto this long diagonal. But obviously this is an incredibly aggressive move because black neglects kingside development. Nepo continued with his plan of g4, bishop b7. Now Carlsen himself has played f3 in this position just to secure the e-pawn. But Nepo just pushed on with g5. Now in game 1 of this match, Carlsen put the knight back on d7. Really, really messy position that Carlsen got the better of and won. But this time, he decided to take that pawn in the middle of the board. Now this is really brave. He wouldn't have had much time to look at this in between the games. They have very little break in between these games. I mean, maybe he had a second working behind the scenes who told him in between games, I should emphasize, that it's possible to take this pawn and maybe it's worth risking. I don't know. I mean, I still think this is an incredibly brave decision to take this pawn. Nepo exchanged, and here played a4, which is a pretty good destabilizing move and was clearly preparation. Alexander Grishuk was commentating on this game on Chess24, and he said that he had looked at this position and in his preparation found the most extraordinary trap. Now let me show you this because this is really beautiful. So just a reminder, a4 was played in the game. We're going to look at that in a second. But Grishuk instead said that he'd been looking at queen g4, very natural move, bringing the queen out, attacking the bishop goes back. Bishop g2, also very natural. Now, bishop takes g2, probably not best. Queen c7 is decent, but bishop takes g2. Queen takes g2, so the queen attacks the rook. Rook a7 is okay for black, but knight d7 is the most natural move. And now, here's a very tricky idea. g6, and when this is taken, h takes g6, knight e6. How brilliant is this? Now obviously that's checkmate. The knight attacks the queen. If the queen moves to the side, then queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, and knight c7 forks king and queen with a winning position. Now black does have other defences. Rook h2 keeps black in the game, although white is a lot better there. But basically this trap is working. Knight e6 gives white an excellent position, if not a winning position. So queen g4 is also possible. It just shows you that the kind of ideas that white has available in this position, because for the price of one pawn, white has free development for all his pieces. Black's development, well, look, the king is stuck in the middle. That bishop won't be able to move for a bit. I just think this is an incredibly brave decision of Carlsen to take this pawn. Let's see the game. A4, a good destabilizing move. Of course, B4 is the principled move to try and keep things closed. But then that pawn is a little bit loose. Loose pieces drop off. You could take, but that would bring the rook into the game. Tricky decision for Carlsen, and he thought for some time here. And eventually played E5. And after very little thought, Nepo sacked a piece with A takes B5. If pawn takes knight, then queen takes pawn attacks the bishop. So let's say that's defended. Let's say rook G3. That could be interesting. Maybe swinging across here. Maybe even coming across to the not in this case not A3 because the bishop is on, but certainly coming to E3 is a possibility. And black's problem is that if the bishop moves, then queen takes G7 just wrecks the king side. So for the foreseeable, black's king is stuck in the middle. And don't forget, pawn takes pawn. Well, I think understandably, Carlsen didn't want to touch pawn takes knight. Instead, he played bishop E7, very sensible, preparing to castle on the king side. Rook G4 from Nepo. So this is getting really wild and wacky now. The rook advancing up the board. And that will mean that white's king is going to be stuck in the middle. And then you're going to ask yourself, well, which king is safer? Let's see. If the bishop goes back this way, then there's knight F5. If the bishop goes back this way, whoops, I misfired. If the bishop goes back this way, then queen F3 claims a nice diagonal. Carlsen just took on B5. So if rook takes bishop, rook takes rook. So very strange tactics here. Bishop takes B5 check. Tricky decision for black. He could play king F8, but it doesn't look very attractive. Carlsen played knight D7. Bishop D2. So the rook was on, so now the rook is protected. And the bishop came back to B7. And now knight F5. This looks very difficult for black. With that knight looking at all these points. And it's so often the case in the Sicilian, I know this through bitter experience, that if white manages to get a knight on F5, then that can cause trouble. That's why often many players like to leave the pawn on E6 to guard against knights coming into F5 or D5. But so G6 is possible here. But I mean, maybe the knight would even go to H6 just to stop black castling. That's a possibility. In any case, after knight F5, Carlsen decided to castle, which does bring the king to some kind of safety behind those pawns, but white still has an attack. Now, incredibly, rook A4 is suggested by my computer, just steering away from the king. And in fact, it's very strong because these pieces, all white's pieces, are hassling black's pieces. And actually, even after this exchange, it is with the idea of rook A7, it is very hard for black to keep control over all these pieces. And you can see black is just kind of caught in all these pins. The knight is still great on F5. Very unpleasant for black. But rook A4 is the kind of move you don't play when you're playing very quickly. Of course, Nepo decided to concentrate on the king side. He exchanged rooks on a8 and then played rook h4. Of course, it's so natural. You're going to do that. And with white's pieces so active and the queen looking to come to h5, you're going to do this. And it certainly isn't bad for white. Queen h5 threatens, so g6. Queen g4. No need to move that knight. That would just dissipate white's initiative. And the queen simply wants to come to h3 and just pursue the attack down the h-file. Oops. That was a misfire. So, how did Carlsen play after queen g4? I should add that Carlsen was running really short of time, whereas Nepo, well, as was his wont, he plays very, very quickly and just playing very natural moves. But this is tough for black to defend. Knight c5. And now queen h3. Queen h3 is actually a mistake. Again, a very computery move. King f1 is the approved move. And the idea is to threaten bishop a5. And now if that's taken, it's no longer check. And just distracting the queen away from this bishop. So, okay, here's the basic idea. So if knight e4, let's say, bishop a5, and after queen takes bishop, knight check, rook takes pawn check, and now mate on h6. Nice sacrifices. But king f1, I mean, a very difficult move to spot. And black does have alternative defences there. Nepo played the natural move, queen h3. And here, Carlsen cracked. He should have taken on g5. Let's just have a quick look. Bishop g5 actually saves black here. Here's the idea that after rook takes pawn, well, threatening a couple of mates in one, bishop takes bishop check, king takes bishop, queen g5. I'm going to give you the main line here. There are, of course, alternatives for both sides. But basically, this is best play. Black can chase the king, and it looks as though, in fact, white's king is in desperate trouble here. But with care, white can avoid mate. And in fact, this should end in perpetual check, like this. And queen here, and so on. So bishop g5 would have held the game. Instead, Carlsen played h5. Blunder. After rook takes pawn, pawn takes rook, queen takes pawn, there is no decent defense. So, well, the first threat is basically queen h6. There's also g6, and white is breaking through to the king. In fact, Carlsen played knight e6 and resigned. He'd seen enough. Let's just see how white wins this. So g6 threatens queen h7. These moves are all forced in the variation I'm going to show you. Even though it takes a bit of time to actually get to checkmate, they're very easy moves. So queen h7 mate threatened. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn check. Only move king h8. And now we can win the knight on e6 by force with queen h6, king g8, queen takes knight check. If the king goes this way, then there'll be queen check and mate. So rook f7, knight h6, king g7, queen takes rook check. Now white's piece up, but let's go to the end. Why not? Bishop d3 threatens mate. That gets blocked. Opens this diagonal. Reminds me of one of my problems I've been setting on the channel. Bishop c3 check. Bishop blocks. We don't want to take that queen. Queen g8 mate finishes a little bit quicker. There we go. So Nepo won game 3. Game 4 was a draw. Carlsen took no chances. Decided to play solidly in that fourth rapid game. So they went into a tiebreak of 2 blitz games. And Carlsen held his nerve and won both of them. Wow, I mean, what a first day. Carlsen losing in 21 moves in this game, and yet still picking himself up and winning that first set. But we have the second set tomorrow, day 2, and I'm sure that before this match is over, we're going to see many twists and turns. So keep watching. Thanks very much for watching this.